Welcome to another edition of Walton Entertainment. Today we'll have more news, information, and entertainment from your local hometown.
The state of Georgia versus Mayor John Howard, Chief Tyrone Oliver, Lieutenant Brent Davis, Mayor Ray Martinez, Dr. Stephen and Kathy Whitworth, Claire Klein, Keemia Motley, and Paige Connor. You are guilty of losing. See you February 16th at the Porter Performing Arts Center in Covington.
Welcome to Walton County, a journey into the heart of Southern living. Colonists first settled the area in the late 1700s. Since then, 7 former governors have called Walton County home. In Monroe, the stately home of Governors McDaniel and Walker still stand as symbols of our political heritage. The county, though growing, retains its rural flavor with an abundance of gently rolling hills and open spaces. The downtown areas offer many attractions, including an array of antique and specialty shops, where many treasures, such as collectible glassware, figurines, heirloom quilts, and a fascinating display of late 19th century tools can be found. If you're curious about primitive plantation life, you'll find some answers at the Harris Homestead. Built by William Harris between 1820 and 1830, this farm chronicles the middle-class lifestyle of an early pioneer. Placed on the National Register of Historical Places in 1982, it has since received a Citation for Excellence Award from the Georgia Trust for Historic Preservation. A walking tour of Monroe begins at the Davis Edwards House, built in the 1840s. The Historical Society of Walton County has faithfully preserved this modified plantation plain home, which is available for tours and special events. In the center of town is the beautifully restored courthouse. This 1883 landmark has survived the ravages of time, and from its grounds, our soldiers have marched to war, observed victories, and honored their heroes. Adjacent to the courthouse is the old Walton Hotel, once a welcome retreat for weary travelers in the late 1800s, and now being restored to its historic elegance. Communities looking for ways to make good use of abandoned buildings will appreciate the efforts of the Monroe Art Guild. Thanks to the Guild, the grand old post office has been reopened as a gallery for local artists and a cultural center for residents and visitors. Originally built in the late 1800s, the stately home of Governor Henry D. McDaniel was recently bequeathed to the Georgia Trust for Historic Preservation. This magnificent home is furnished in fine antiques, family portraits, dozens of volumes from the governor's personal library, and is now available for tours. The Old Baptist Cemetery on the outer boundary of the estate is resting place to many of our community's historic leaders, including Governor Clifford Walker. Housed in the turn-of-the-century train depot is a unique collection of hand-painted cast iron replicas of American lighthouses. Georgia Railroad's main line played an important role in the growth of the county in the early 1900s. Today, the now privately owned Great Walton Railroad continues to operate between Monroe and Social Circle. The Well, in the center of Social Circle's business district, is a unique focal point and symbol of the town's namesake. According to legend, a stranger approached the gathering at this favorite meeting place and was greeted with such hospitality that he exclaimed, "This is surely a social circle." Collectibles, gifts, period pieces, and browsing in the quaint brick shops offer the visitor an old-time flavor of yesteryear. Folklore and legend abound throughout the village. Among the most interesting is the sibling rivalry of the Upshaw brothers, John and Sanders, dating back to the late 1800s. Upon his marriage, John built a two-story Victorian cottage for his family. In 1916, his brother Sanders built a columned mansion directly opposite. Not to be outdone, John promptly had his cottage moved to the adjacent lot, then built an even grander mansion using brick instead of wood, a red-tiled roof rather than slate, each room just a few inches larger, and so on. In spite of their fierce competition, the families, however, remain cordial, and for visiting purposes, each built a perfectly aligned brick walkway from one grand entrance to the other. Today, these historic homes are thriving enterprises for everyone to enjoy. Sanders' home, an exclusive boutique, and John's home, the landmark Blue Willow Inn restaurant, host to local and international visitors and celebrities. Traveling throughout the scenic countryside reflects pastoral farm life as well as historical glimpses of the past. Anchorage Plantation, for example, was the oldest standing residence in nearby Madison, Georgia, when its present owner moved it to this new location in 1985. This federal-style home was built in 1810 by Dr. William Johnston. It was enlarged and columns added in the Greek Revival style in 1857. Walton County, rich in history and southern charm, birthplace of Moena Michael, internationally known as the Poppy Lady, and Martha Lumpkin, daughter of Governor Wilson Lumpkin, for whom Marthasville was named before being renamed Atlanta. Yes, a visit to Walton County is truly an opportunity to savor the past, enjoy the present, and anticipate the future.
This is my daughter, Audrey, and her son, Aiden. My daughter was being abused in a relationship that I didn't know about, that she was being abused. But she called me at work, it was a Friday, and she said, he's threatening me, I gotta get out, he's gonna kill me. So she went to my persuasion to get a TPA. She got the restraining order, and being naive and not knowing anything about the legal system and domestic violence and all that, I didn't know that's a piece of paper, pretty much, and so I felt like she's safe now, okay? He can't bother her anymore. Well, that was on a Friday, so she got to live another week. Let me back up, I think. Anyway, it's around that time. Mm-hmm. Yeah, another week. So he started harassing her with phone calls, and the police told her, just to record all this stuff, to keep all these things for your case, a better case. And it got to be more harassing, and she was becoming more afraid. So her and I went to my mother's house to stay because we were afraid that he was going to come around or something. and we were down there hiding out pretty much. And she did that for a week, and her job wanted her to come in, so she did. And they told her, be sure, well, the police told her, you know, we'll be there when you get off of work to make sure you're safe in your car. Well, they had changed her schedule that night and forgot to tell the police, so they were not there when she got off work, but her boss walked her to the car. She got in her car. On her way home, she decided to stop about half a mile away, stop at a gas station. And she went in a gas station, paid for her stuff, and went back out to her car. And she decided to look in the back of her car because he had done that before, hiding in the back of her car. So when she saw him in the back of her car, she ran back inside the gas station, and she said, call 911, he's out there, I've got a restraining order, he's not supposed to be there or anything. So I think several people started calling 911. Well, he got out of the car and he went into the gas station, shot her 13 times, right in front of everybody. After he killed my daughter, he barricaded himself inside his home, and a SWAT team came and they were surrounding his house, and I think it was 7 hours they were out there, and finally they decided they were going to go in, and because he would not come out, he would just demand his child. He wanted his son. He wanted to see his son again, and since that wasn't possible, he was calling relatives, threatening them, saying, you're next, I'm getting you next. It was a nightmare for our whole family. It was terrible. But after they decided to go into the house, once they knocked the door down, I guess, he shot himself and killed himself, like the coward that he is and was. I'm a firm believer everybody has to have a reason to get up in the morning, you know? And for me, that child that I had to raise, of course, I had to get up every morning. I had to go through the motions of caring for him and working and putting everything down as far low as I could, my emotions, until he would go to bed at night. And then, of course, I'd fall apart again and get up the next morning and do it all over again. But, you know, that kept me going. He kept me going, staying present in the moment today. That's what I had and do focus on, because if I can't think about tomorrow, that pain is too deep. I just can't. And I want to make my daughter proud. I want to make her son proud. I want to make my family proud. And I want to see her again. So I'm doing the best I can. I'm speaking out. That gives me hope and courage that I can make a difference, and so that nobody else will have to do that again.
Where do you come alive? A stadium, lecture hall, a music hall, church potluck? This year, you have a new spot, walkgeorgia.org, a free website that provides you with all the resources needed to get your heart rate up and body out in your community. Sign up and receive individual or group fitness tracking, fitness demos by certified trainers, recipes, and a guide to resources in your Georgia County, all in one easy-to-use site. When you move more, you live more. walkgeorgia.org.
This is Paul Mullins with Walton Entertainment, and today we're with Arthur Bowick, and he's going to reflect growing up and how the funeral business, how he got started in it, and then kind of what it is today. So, Arthur, just start with your childhood.
Well, Paul, I was born and raised in Blackshear, Pierce County, Georgia, small southeast Georgia town of about 3,000 people. I was invited or asked by the local funeral director back when I was around 12, 13 years old to come to work for him, which he always had a young teenager working for him. And he and my dad were good friends, and we lived right behind the funeral home. So this is how I got started. I just went over one Sunday morning and went to work and never stopped. Within a year and a half or 2 years, I guess, I had decided that I wanted to follow funeral service because I saw, I thought that if I could get people to think half as much of me as they did of him, then I would be a success. Because small town funeral directors, well, all funeral directors for that go, but particularly small towns were well thought of because they provided a service to take care of the deceased individuals, which was the most valuable thing that people had, was the death of their loved one. And I want to just add a little bit to this. Now you have these programs where kids get out of school and go to work and so forth and so on during school. Back in 1953 and 54, they didn't do that, but I did. I got the idea that I was going to quit playing baseball and go to work at a funeral home in the afternoon. It would do me more good in the future. And I went in and convinced the principal of my high school to let me out of school every day at the end of fourth period. So at the end of fourth period, everybody either went to their sports they were playing, or they went to study hall. I walked back down the street to the funeral home and went to work. So I was a forerunner of all this vocational ed stuff, or whatever you might call it. But anyway, after I decided, of course, that I did want to follow funeral service after high school, I went to Young Harris Junior College up in North Georgia for 2 years. And then I saw that my name was beginning to get to the top of the list to be drafted. So I went to the draft board and found out that I was right. So I volunteered for the Army, because if the Army had drafted me, they'd have sent me, it would have been for 2 years, but they would have sent me where they wanted me to go after basic training. If you volunteer for another year, you get to pick the school you want to go to. And the Army is the only branch of service that has a service that takes care of deceased personnel. Excuse me. So I volunteered to go to Graves Registration School, which was in Fort Lee, Virginia. And then, of course, I went overseas and spent 2.5 years in Germany. First, I was assigned to a GR school. In the last 4 or 5 months, I was assigned to the U.S. Army Mortuary in Frankfort, Connecticut. And that mortuary handled all Americans, service or civilian. If they were connected to the military or the State Department, they returned all of those remains back to Dover Air Force Base from the continent. And then once I got out of the service, I went to Cincinnati College of Mortuary Science. And fortunately for me, that's where I met my wife, Jeannie. She lived in there in a suburb of Cincinnati, and we both attended the same Baptist church. And that's how we got to know each other. And of course, we married after I got out of school and started a slow migration north from southeast Georgia and wound up buying a funeral home here in Monroe in 1967. But when I was growing up, funeral service was quite different than it is now. Most small town, medium town funeral homes at that time provided ambulance service. And people say, what in the world did a funeral home do providing ambulance service? Well, it was simple. They were the only people in town that had a vehicle that was long enough and a cot to go in the back of it. So they picked up deceased personnel when they died. So they started picking up live people and taking them to the hospitals, because hospitals back then in small rural areas were few and far between. So it actually started in the horse and buggy days. And then, of course, with the advent of the automobile, why naturally the funeral coaches were made to be able to roll a cot in and pick up ambulance patients or deceased personnel. Then you just flip the floor over in the back, and it had rollers where you could roll the casket in. This is what we call a combination coach. And this went on till about 1971 or 2, and the government finally came to the conclusion that the ambulance service we were providing was not good enough. And I would agree with them, because we only had an oxygen tank and a pretty good sized first aid kit, but we really had no training like the EMTs of today. So they began to put pressure on the funeral homes to discontinue the ambulance service. And so myself and the other funeral home at that time in Monroe, the E.L. Allman Company, discontinued our ambulance service in 1973. And the counties took it over at that time. But growing up in a small town, as I said, you see a lot of families. I I went to school with a lot of the children and grandchildren of the elderly people there that we grew up with, and a lot of the ministers, and got to know them real well. And as I said, the people in the small towns always thought a lot of their funeral director, because he took care of the most valuable thing they had when they lost a loved one. And that still holds true today to a certain extent. But back in the 40s and 50s in my hometown, we probably cremated one person every 4 years. And the nearest crematory was Jacksonville, Florida, which is 80 miles south. Cremation has continued to grow, and most people have the idea it's because of the monetary situation and the cost. And that is true up to a point, but a lot of it is due to demographics. The younger generation just do not have the traditions of their parents and their grandparents. And a lot of the younger generation just don't see any need in a funeral service. To them, it's just a sort of waste of time. I mean, they love their loved ones, but they just figure that, they're dead, and we'll have a little service for the family, or we'll have a memorial service, and we'll cremate the individual and whatnot. And then, of course, you have the demographics, which means basically when a girl leaves home and goes to college, and the boy leaves home and goes to college, and he's from the southeast and she's from the northwest, and they meet and they get married, and they wind up living in the middle of the country. They get a phone call in the middle of the night that one of them's parents has died, and they sit there wringing their hands. What are we going to do? We got 2 small children. We got to go back to the southeast or the northwest and have a funeral and blah, blah, blah. And then the idea comes up, well, why don't we just call the funeral home and have them fax us the papers, and we'll sign them, and we'll cremate the individual, and then we'll go down when it's convenient this summer and have a memorial service. So a lot of it has to do with things other than monetary. But I'll admit, and be the first to admit, that funerals, of course, are going up. But, of course, so are weddings. Average wedding today is $25,000, $30,000. So a funeral is really a bargain when you get right down to it. But a lot of people don't look at it that way. But after coming to Monroe, of course, Jeannie and I were accepted by the community. We, of course, purchased the Williams and Smith Funeral Home in January '67. We kept the name William Smith for about 7.5, 8 years before we changed it. And I really didn't want to change it then, because in small towns, names of businesses are very important. The tradition, you might look out here, Carmichael Drugs. They've already been through 3 owners that have passed away, and it's still Carmichael Drug. And so we finally changed the name, and we refurnished the funeral home building we were in, and so on and so forth. And of course, we had 3 children that we raised here, and they've all been very successful, and we've been very, very proud and very fortunate to live in Monroe. Getting back to the early days, I guess when I was growing up, 98% of the funerals were in churches. Many funeral homes did not have chapels per se that were large enough to accommodate a large number of people. So down in Pierce County, where I come from, 98% of the funerals were in churches. 98% of the people were taken back home and laid out, and everyone just came to the residence and brought food, and they usually kept them out for about 2 days and 2 nights, and then the 3rd day we would have the funeral. And of course today it's much different. Today the visitation is held the same day of the funeral for an hour or 2 hours, depending upon how many people the family thinks might come and so forth, and give them time to get there. And then of course graveside services are a little bit more prevalent, because people just kind of feel like, well, why should we load up and have everybody come to the funeral home or the church or whatnot and so forth, and we'll just have a graveside service. So it's much different today than it used to be. But like I said, it all kind of goes back to tradition, to values, and I'm not saying the younger people don't have values, but they sit there today with a little thing like this when we didn't have that back when I grew up.
And the funeral homes today also offer kind of a memorial service in the funeral home, where it's kind of a party. Have you experienced any of that?
Well, we didn't have too much of that when we were still in the profession, but yes, they do have a gathering, a visitation, whatever you want to call it, and a lot of your new funeral homes build event rooms, and the family can use that for a meal or a gathering of the family. As you say, it's consider us, I guess you could call it a sort of a party. And then, of course, those funeral homes will rent those rooms for people to have other events like wedding receptions and so on and so forth. That if you go to new modern funeral homes that have been built in the last 8 to 9, 10 years, you'll find a lot of them have event rooms like that they use. And they even go so far as to contract with caterers to cater the food for the families, whereas the families or the friends of the families used to bring all the food in. Now, funeral homes, particularly up in the northern part of the country, more so than here in the south, I have been fortunate enough to have been associated with 2 or 3 funeral home organizations, one of which was located out of Springfield, Illinois, and when I went to their meetings and their conventions and so forth, I really got my eyes open when I talked to funeral directors up in the Northeast and the Midwest about their funeral homes with their event rooms, and them they would cater the food and so on and so forth. It's very different, but it's slowly leaking down to the South and the Southeast and the Southwest more so than it used to be. Even cemeteries now have buildings in the back of the part of their cemetery where families can meet and have memorial services, and there again they will rent these out for families to use for different kind of events, which of course in my upbringing was very, very unusual and unheard of.
Do you notice in the funerals nowadays, are there you don't have as many people, seems like, as you used to, because it was a network of a family in a community, and now people are spread all over the U.S. and into foreign countries, and that's made a difference, hasn't it?
You're right. Funeral service attendance has slowly been reduced, and by the very reasons you mentioned. Families get scattered, as I mentioned about the couple that's married in different parts of the country. Grandchildren move off, and kids call them up and tell them, "So, well, I know you're busy. Hard for you to get off, etc., etc., etc." Another thing, and we don't realize it here in a small town, is communication. When, like you say, in the 40s and 50s, I would say that 75% of the families in Walton County were probably intermarried to some degree. May not be directly a brother and sister or whatnot, but they had cousins and so forth that would marry, and so everybody in the churches and in the community would know when somebody died and pass the word around. Now, of course, they either have to get on the phone and call, and there's not as many people left to do the calling. The newspapers, of course, run obituaries, but as you know, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution has just recently suspended their delivery to homes. Now you have to go down and buy one at the convenience store if you want a paper. So the daily paper is not here anymore. And of course, even though we have a good local paper that's only produced twice a week, most of the time people look in there and see if someone has died that they didn't even hear about. And that's the case of Jeannie and I right now. We a lot of times don't know that friends of ours have passed away until we get the Tribune and read about it. So it is a lot different. Communications are not like it used to be.
Well, thank you so much for this interview. It's been most enlightening. Let me ask you a little bit about the caskets and all back, say in the 50s and all, in the caskets of today. Have they changed a lot?
Not a whole lot. Now, you have to go back a little further than the 50s. Back in the old West and Boot Hill days, of course, we see in the movies and so forth, most caskets were made of pine. They had a flat top, and they were a little angled at the feet and the head. And when some guy got shot or died, the local undertaker would take $25 from somebody and put the gentleman or the lady in the casket and go out to Boot Hill and dig a grave and bury him, and there was no embalming and so on and so forth. Embalming came about after the Civil War, when some doctors were trying to figure out how to preserve the remains of the Confederate and Union soldiers to get them back to their respective homes. And of course they started using different chemicals, one of which was very prevalent was arsenic. And then after a few years, they realized, of course, that arsenic wasn't a good idea. And the government said, you can't do it anymore, because if I wanted to kill you and I poured you with arsenic, and then the funeral home put embalming fluid through your body with arsenic in it, they wouldn't know whether the arsenic was there before or after you died. So that had to be changed. But there were several prominent doctors in the United States that started embalming, and in fact, 2 or 3 of them established their own embalming colleges, and then some were what we call traveling colleges. They would go from town to town to bigger cities as they begin to grow and have 8 or 10 week courses, which was very basic, but it taught an individual how to inject the remains with some kind of fluid, etc., and so forth. Then, of course, caskets did start changing a little bit, because the early casket makers were cabinet makers. And the early funeral directors, most of the time, were in the furniture business, because in small towns there weren't enough people dying a year to provide with a profitable living. So the funeral director had to have some of the business. In fact, the E.L. Allman Company here in Monroe, which was here for many years, was in Social Circle, and they had a hardware store down there when they first started their funeral home. The funeral home that I started working for in my hometown of Blackshear was also started by a gentleman who had a funeral home, and then next door he had a company, which I'm not sure what you call it, but he sold tobacco barn supplies and flues and so forth to manufacture tobacco barns, which was very prevalent in southeast Georgia at that time. So he had something to make him a little money on during the week when he wasn't having funerals. But if you go back and look in a funeral home directory, which are published even today, used to be more than they are now, you would see it would have so-and-so funeral home and furniture store, so-and-so funeral home and hardware, and so forth. And then, of course, the cabinet makers had the wood, so they were the ones that were asked to make the caskets. And then, of course, casket companies started on their own, mainly in the Midwest. And then, of course, they didn't change a whole lot, but they changed from not being flat top and not being beveled in at the end and the head. They were the same distance or same width from head to toe. And then, of course, the biggest thing in the last 7 or 8 years is caskets being made in China. Not that a lot of us are against the Chinese people, but they make them a whole lot cheaper than the American manufacturers, and therefore some of these people in America trying to make $1, which again I don't blame them for that, will import Chinese caskets and then turn around and sell them to the funeral homes, and if the funeral homes willing to buy them to make a little more profit, then a lot of people are being buried today in caskets made in China. But there's been a little bit of a repercussion in the last year or two, I understand, from friends of mine in the funeral profession, that the Chinese caskets are not always, you might be careful, one of the handles might come off when you're trying to carry the casket away from the church or something. So a little bit of this is kind of revolving into a little different situation. But basically now, your caskets are still made pretty much the same.
All right. Well, thank you for your time. This has been Arthur Bowick. This is Paul Mullins with Walton Entertainment.
You may not know my name per se, but I'm definitely sure you've seen my work. I've worked with artists of the likes of Beyonce, Mariah Carey, Katy Perry, Rihanna. The list goes on and on and on. I've been in Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater. I've been on Broadway. I've done several TV shows, but I'm here now in Atlanta as the founder of Anthony Burrell Center for Dance. I knew that dance was going to be a part of my journey when I saw a video of the Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater at the age of 14. And from that moment, I knew that's exactly where I wanted to go. Because I saw dancers that looked like me, that were my same skin color, were my same height, that looked like my father. And I just realized, hey, you know, all the images that I've ever saw of dancers were always different from who I was. And when I finally saw Alvin Ailey, I knew immediately that that was going to be my dream job. Being able to see my work on some of the biggest stages in the world, like the Super Bowl, Madison Square Garden, Wembley Stadium, all over the world. It's a dream come true. You know, as a kid from South Philadelphia, I never fathomed that I would be able to work with a Mariah Carey or choreograph for a Beyonce or win an MTV award per se, you know. Those are all dreams that have come true, and it's been all through dance. So to sit back, and sometimes I'm still in awe, you know, of some of the things I've done. Yeah.
Hello, Walton County. I'm continuing the introduction of different prominent Walton County leaders and Walton County business people that have, along the way, have made Walton County and Monroe a big difference. And today I have Mr. Harry Brown with us. He's been a longtime businessman here in Walton County. His daddy was a businessman here prior to that. And so part of the 200th celebration of Walton County, I'm going to be interviewing him today and letting him tell us a little bit about his time here and what all he's seen change in Monroe and Walton County. Mr. Harry, we're glad to have you here today, and I'll just let you tell us a little bit about where you were born and a little bit about your childhood and how you wound up downtown Monroe.
Well, I was born out on Diegas, John Deere Farm,
Okay.
1930. And during the middle of the Great Depression, and it was very lean out there, and my dad needed something a little bit better for his little family, and Mr. Emory Gordon was the high sheriff, and he was Daddy's uncle, and he brought my father to town in a little service station right down here on Spring Street, a little wooden building.
Okay.
And I'll tell you who the distributor was, Mr. Tom Williams.
Okay.
Jack Williams' daddy was a distributor. But anyway, he started off there, and Mr. Lanya's oil company, Mr. Harry Lanya, remodeled this old building here. And my father came up, moved his station up here to this, which is right directly in the center.
Around what year was that?
About 35.
Okay.
He didn't stay down there too long. He came to town in 33.
33.
And my father moved his family down here right where the theater burned. It was a big two-story brick house. It had 4 apartments in it. And we lived in 2 rooms. My grandma Brown lived upstairs. There was a lady upstairs had a beauty shop, Ms. O'Kelly, who was Randy Garrett's grandmother.
Okay.
And then your folks, Mr. Adcock, Lamar Adcock's daddy.
Okay.
And he moved his family on the other side of the hall.
All the farmers had to come to town during the Great Depression.
My daddy brought his cow and his hog and planted a garden out back there.
Pretty amazing in downtown Monroe.
Oh, absolutely, that's the way it was.
That's right, because that's how you survived. You fed and raised what you eat.
He was able to milk his cow and do the necessary things you do on the farm, and that helped. And my mother worked in the cardwood plant, but before the cardwood, she took in sewing. She was a seamstress.
Okay.
And back in those days, there was lots of girls that had polio. And they would have to have they couldn't go to Acock's department store and buy a dress without it being altered or complete to make it work. And my mother could take a pattern and make them a dress.
Good.
And she started off doing that. And so that's the way that we survived up to a point. But when he got a hold of this bigger building, with the courthouse, people coming in and out, and the farmers coming to town, and like I told you before, they love to talk about how far along the crop.
That's right.
That was big time talk back in those days. So that was all back in the early 30s. And I can bring you up to 34, 35 for the kindergarten I told you about.
There you go.
Not
You
down
went to
on-
school, you said, on Church Street,
It was
right?
an old big building on Church Street that would actually sit behind the National Guard Armory. And they tore it down, and then across the street, the big red building was junior high.
Okay.
But there was a very startling thing happened. When they put us in the first grade, 36, the high school burned. It was right over here,
Okay.
what they call Bowles Springs, that right there.
Mhm. North Madison and
That's
North
right.
Springs.
It was a high school, so the people in high school got our building,
Okay.
and I went to school right back here in that office that you got is for your meeting room.
Okay.
And that was the grand jury room. I went to the first grade right there. And also, second grade was in the Baptist church.
Mhm.
Third grade was up here in the old Methodist church that sat on the corner in that vacant lot where Scoops is,
Okay.
across the street.
Mm-hmm.
But and then the time I got in about the fourth grade, they got the building ready and we got to go back in our school. But I went to school right here.
Okay. So, and then you graduated over from there. Is that where y'all graduated in the auditorium?
Oh, yeah,
Over there.
back over there in
Okay. What year was that you graduated?
47.
47.
I've been out 71 years.
All right. That's good. But all during that time, you worked here at the gas station,
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
Mhm.
I mean, that's just the way it was.
Did you have any brothers and sisters?
No brothers, had a sister,
Yes.
but she was at home with her mother.
Okay.
And, but,
So you and your daddy run the business?
oh, yeah, and he would leave, but believe it or not, he would leave it with me when I was 7 years old.
All right.
And I explained to you how the old pumps,
That's right. Pump the gas up in there and measure
up
it,
in
and
the
then you run it
glass
out
bowl,
into the
and you
vehicle.
could see it going into the,
Mm-hmm.
and you measured off how much. But anyway, I guess that sort of brings you up to the way we got started,
That's
how
right.
we lived, and how lean things were. But my mother and father did make a living for us. They made a living for us. And at one time, we had two big cotton mills down there.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes they could work 3 days a week, but they knew they were going to get a paycheck.
Mm-hmm.
And that was real big for Walton County.
That's right.
That was a plus.
Guaranteed money.
Well, you know, you got a paycheck. I mean, that was big stuff.
That's right.
there.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, that sort of brings you up to the war years, before the war years. Now, the war, of course, started in 41,
Mm-hmm.
but there was a lot of lapse time in the old filling station over there. And we did a lot of business. We fixed a lot of flat tires, the city recalipers and all those boys were in business.
You were the only one in town.
We were the only one just about
Mhm.
fixing tires and pumping gas.
And there wasn't no paved roads then. I'm sure every road was dirt.
Everything out there was dirt.
So
Good
that-
Hope Road didn't get paved till, I think, about 69.
Okay.
Maybe it was 59,
Yeah.
something like that, when the Good Hope Road got paved. And it was one of the big roads.
Yeah.
It was Highway 83 down there.
Mm-hmm. So,
But anyway, I don't have a date just exactly, but I was already driving the car.
mm-hmm.
I remember one time we went to a basketball game in Boston. My dad had a Buick. And when the road was so rough, when we got down to Boston, it shook the battery out of the thing.
Mm.
And we had to tie the old battery back in the car.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of stories of how bad the roads. My grandmama used to tell me if they had a little rain, you know, they over on Pole Hill down near Cowpens, you know, they said they had poles laying out there that you had to put under your vehicle to help you get to the top of the hill.
Oh, yeah, well, back in those days, you did what you had to work with.
That's right.
That's the way it was. It wasn't like calling a wrecker.
There wasn't nothing out there.
That's
was
right, there wasn't much out.
And so, so y'all kept this station open and throughout your dad's life, or and
Well, nearly throughout his life, that's where I was raised, right there for 30 years.
mm-hmm.
And like I say, Mr. Lewis Howard and Mr. Doc Sauls were right here, and we could
Mhm.
see them, and they could see us.
That's right.
It was pretty good protection.
You're right.
And that room was not there.
Uh huh. Yeah, that was an
Thomas
addition.
Hodges built that room
Mhm.
later on.
That's right.
But anyway, that brought it, that sort of would bring it up to the war years. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, talk a little bit about that, the World War II and the era there.
Okay, the war, of course, started in 1941 in December, and just a few weeks it had become 42 in
That's
January.
Right.
And I was 11 years old, and I can remember very, very much that there was a two-story part of this old building, and there was two doctors up there, Dr. Tom Aycock and Dr. Lott.
Okay.
And when the war got started, every able-bodied young man got drafted. Now they had to come into a simple physical right here, and Dr. Tom Aycock was doing it.
Okay.
And I have seen them line up as far as the bank down here. I'm talking about young men, 17 and a half and 18
That's right.
years old. And he would give them a physical and line them up, and there would be a bus, which would be a Walton County school bus to come pick them up and carry them to Atlanta, to Fort Mac, or where they carry.
Okay.
But I saw it wasn't very long till all the young able-bodied men were gone. They were actually gone. And the older men and the ladies had to go to work. A lot of the women on the farm that hadn't worked had to go to work.
Okay.
And they worked in the mill. They worked in these two plants out here. Believe it or not, from where we sit, and we can look out this window, there was 200 ladies worked right there. One of them was the old plant that's torn down called Southeastern.
Okay.
And the other one was a potluck building.
That's right.
At the Callwood. And they cut it in half.
I remember the Callwood, but I don't remember the
Well, it was
Southeast.
right yonder.
Okay.
And the gentleman that owned that was Mr. Coleman Wright. And then, of course, the fellow that ran that one over there was Harold Whitehead.
Okay.
But they ran them all during the war. And all.
So the ladies come back and run those plants then, they were all at home on the
They
farm.
went to work. I mean,
Everybody
went to work.
Everybody had to take care.
Everybody went to work.
Because all their sons and were all overseas fighting.
Everybody was working for the war effort. And they were getting up scrap metal and whatever they could do. And this was back during the war.
That's right.
War years.
Now, so I would imagine that y'all's business hurt a little bit too during that time.
Well, there was two things that happened during that. I'll have to brag about it just a little bit. They had designated my daddy to be the tie inspector. Now, the tie inspector amounted to each one of the old passenger cars' tires had a serial number on it.
Okay.
If you had a Model A Ford, if you had a little better car, and you had a set of tires on it, you had to register your serial number.
Okay.
So it was my dad's job supposed to be for the county, and we did get a lot of serial numbers.
Okay.
And put them on a piece of paper and record them. He had a little file that he kept all, and then gasoline was rationed.
I knew it was rationed.
And if you were just a regular family man, then you got an A sticker to put in your window, and that's all you got.
Okay.
You had the stamps and all, you didn't get any more. And if you did any way different, you got in trouble. But so then the next thing that came along was the fear, the going on fear of an air raid. And everybody sort of thought there might be a possibility that they'd have an air raid. So Monroe had to have an air raid signal.
Okay.
They already had the old fire department, and it had the old. You heard the old.
I remember that alarm. The downburst took it out in '91.
And they never put it back.
That's right. Never put it back.
All right, I'm gonna tell you where the air raid was.
Okay.
Right upstairs here in this clock.
Okay.
Mr. Doc Sarles' job was to wind, so the clock had to be wound where the wind is like throwing a bucket of water.
Okay.
He'd have to go up in this thing and wind the clock. I've been up there with him many times. And we'd wind that old clock, and he fixed that thing where if it was an air raid, it would start striking and not quit.
Okay.
And he had control. I believe there might have been a little switch came down along the wall right here.
Okay, there's a control box up there now that controls it.
Well,
It's
well,
electronic
anyway,
now, but I'm sure then it was more run off of gears.
So what he did, what was done at that particular time, there was a fellow that was chief of police named Mr. Ed Williamson.
Mm-hmm.
And he was Bruce's relations, close
Okay.
by.
Mm-hmm.
And they needed a auxiliary police department.
Mm-hmm.
Well, of course, he walked across the street and got my daddy to be an auxiliary policeman. Now, whether he made him the chief of the thing, I don't know. But
Mm-hmm.
so I remember my dad asking Mr. Doc Saul, said, "What's my uniform going to be?" And he said, "The shirt you got on and a pair of khaki pants and a pistol, a belt for a gun." And my dad said, "Well, I don't have a belt. I don't have and I've got an old holster, but I don't have a belt." He said, "Go right down there to Carl Saw's shoe shop. He'll make you one out of leather."
Okay.
Now, you know what I'm talking about?
I know what you're talking about.
Okay. So that pretty well brings you up to the war years.
That's right.
And we went to school over to the old building that got torn down here,
Mm-hmm.
up through the 5th grade. And when we got to the 6th grade, we went across the street to junior high.
Mm-hmm.
And they had a limited amount of good teachers. And I said all of those people were good teachers.
Mm-hmm.
They had a limited amount of teachers. And when we got in the 7th grade, I believe I must have been about 11 or 12 years old, they would send a bus, if they had one, and carry us over to high school in the big yard over there.
Okay.
And we would do what the Army told us to do. We had calisthenics,
Mm-hmm.
and we had to run the track and do all of these different things, rain and shine.
That's right.
Yeah, but that was even the early war.
And that track is still over there
Still
now.
over there,
Sure
yes,
is.
sir.
Sure is.
And the old gymnasium, of course, it'd have to go further back from me to where it got built.
That's right.
But the name of the thing was Denton Hall.
I've heard that it was called Denton.
Yeah, Denton Hall, and I think anyway, I don't know the history
That's
about
right.
that, but it was there. But anyway, we had by that time, there was one or two Army surplus vehicles, and the school, those two schools had an old Chevrolet truck.
Mm-hmm.
That's something like a pickup, and we'd all, if it didn't send the bus, we'd have to load on that truck and come over here to do the physical ed part of the thing. And that was compulsory to get the money. The part of the school would run on this money coming in.
That's right.
And that was the way that we did it. And then, of course, we got sent to high school in the 8th or 9th grade, I
Mhm.
believe. And we got over there, of course, it all happened.
That's right.
But
Well, that's probably good. Then you went into the 50s. It was probably a little better time as things kind of took off with everybody having automobiles and a little bit better times all around. And so having a gas station and service station was probably a pretty good time during the 50s.
well, the economy really picked up. The economy really got going. I mean, for downtown, well, for Monroe and Walton County.
That's right.
We always, like I told you to start with, and you know, Walton County was the 3rd largest cotton producing county there was in Georgia.
I had heard that.
But that's facts.
Mhm.
And there was a lot of money that went through this gym down, 2
That's right.
gyms down there.
And there was a couple of rural gyms out in the
yeah.
county.
One down there, Mr. Ralph Briscoe.
Ralph
had
Briscoe
one.
had one, and then the
Bradley had
Bradley
one,
gym.
but it burned, I think.
Mhm.
Then there was one in Campton up there, but I can't.
And then there was one over at Youth,
Oh,
where
yeah.
the water,
Johnny Bird, that's
right
right.
below the water department.
Mr. J.T. Bird.
So it makes a lot of sense that Walton County did have a lot of cotton.
It was huge.
That's right.
But anyway, to make a long, the economy, you asked me about that.
In the 50s.
The economy started picking up during the war years, when everybody had to go to work.
That's right.
And my mother had to quit being a seamstress and went to work in the car wood.
Okay.
And she used to say she hemmed breeches all day long, but they were fatigue clothes.
That's
what
right.
They were made. But anyway, that brings it up to the economy part. But the economy got to really going. And during the war, you couldn't get many Coca-Colas, you couldn't get any sugar, and you just had to be careful what you bought and all.
That's right.
But everything was on ration, and all the people were conscientious about this thing. Everybody in this part of the country wanted to win this thing.
That's right.
Yeah, and that's something that I'm not real sure that takes place now.
That's right.
But back then, everybody was really conscientious.
Everybody was all in on anything, wasn't it? Sure was.
All right, well, ask me again, whatever you want.
That's right. Well, as you get it through the 50s and the 60s, the glory years, when did y'all move into the when did you move from here over to the other station?
Well, we stayed here a long time.
Okay.
And the station down there that you see, the tire place.
That's right.
It was built, they tore down two old houses, rental houses, and they belonged to Mr. Booth Williams.
Okay.
And Shell Oil put that station in. That was the Shell station. And leased it to Mr. Bill Murray. He was out here in the car business.
Okay.
And it was right there where the paint store is.
Okay. I knew several car dealerships were downtown.
Well, it was big, and around on Broad was Walker Motor Company, who was Chevrolet.
Okay.
Chevrolet and Olds, and this was Cadillac and Pontiac and GMC truck. Well, we were here, and that building was down there, and Mr. Murray opened it up with his people, and this is a boastful part that I get. With my job over here, I had to join the National Guard in 1948.
Okay.
And I didn't really want to get drafted. I'd rather be here. So I joined the National Guard along with 100 others that were already in there. And went in and kept working. And we had two youngsters and needed a little extra money. And I asked the fellow right in this room down here about a school bus route.
Okay.
And his name was Clyde Pierce.
Okay.
And so...
You become a bus driver, huh?
Well, I drove a Walton County school bus 10 years.
All right.
And I had
That was in the late 40s?
Well, I started in 54.
Okay, 50s, okay.
54. But the fellowship I had with those children was priceless.
That was good. But that brought you a little extra money in.
Well, the thing that I was going to tell you, there was no paved roads. And they gave me the Bowl Springs route, which was the roughest one there was. And the old gentleman had gotten old, and he decided he wanted to give it up, and they let me try it. And I did, and I drove it 10 years.
All right.
And saw some of the roads get paved. The road that you're probably familiar with, the Roscoe Davis Road,
That's right.
was a rough one.
Okay.
Rough. And then the one up there they called James Powell's Road in New Hogan, you couldn't get through there hardly when it rained.
That was all farms then, though, really. Is all
It was farming. It was all these youngsters
That's right, on the farms.
lived out there, you know, and the difference between then and now, those children were so appreciative with everything that we did for them. Now, the children were good and the road was rough.
That's right.
Nowadays,
Roads are good.
the children, I don't think of that
That's right.
appreciative as they were back then. But I worked out at Walker Park School, and the lady that...
But you still worked at the station also,
Oh,
right?
absolutely, all day long.